and it's got all kinds of plants that fit the biotope, and we are going to auction those things off at the end of this talk. Ty, super excited to have you. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Should I go up there? Thank you very much. All right. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Jerry Jones told me I was one of the few British people who he could understand, so we'll try and keep that going. And I'm going to find the clicker. So firstly, I want to thank you all very much for having me here. It's a real honor and a privilege, and I'm very excited to talk to you and share the experiences I've had and some of the things I've seen in this amazing biome, which is the Pantanal wetlands of Brazil. And without further ado,
We can't hear you in the class.
You can't hear me? Shall I speak up like that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I can do that. So I'm going to talk about the Pantanal wetlands of Brazil, and let us begin. So with the first step, I am Ty Strietman. I'm a freshwater biologist. I'm an ichthyologist, and I'm a specialist on freshwater fishes of the Pantanal wetlands. I have worked as an aquarist for London Zoo, but I originally started out in the hobby. I'm sure many people here have had similar experiences, starting their careers in fish stores. Then I went on to London Zoo. Finally, I went on to do a master's in animal biology in Brazil, studying fish in the Pantanal. And I've been very lucky. I've been all around the world to explore habitats and species. So what is the Pantanal and where is it? The Pantanal is a very large wetland area. It's about the size of Idaho. That maybe makes sense to you guys, not so much to me, but that's the comparison I could find. It sits sort of south-central Latin America. So it's where the borders of Bolivia, Brazil, and Paraguay conjoin. So you can see the small red dot.
Up is the laser pointer.
Up is the laser pointer, there. So, and it has two distinct seasons. It's this large area of savanna and fragments of forest, wetlands, lakes, rivers, pools. And it has a dry season where it becomes almost semi-arid. It's like a savanna habitat. And you can see there's rivers, small tributaries moving through the open areas here. And as we get into the wet season, that habitat floods, and the rivers burst their banks. They fill out these lagoons, which are known as baías, and smaller adjoining lagoons and pools. And you have these flooded meadow areas here. And that's the habitat we're going to be focusing on when we set up the display. I'm going to go through and give about half an hour, 40 minutes of quite fast talk as an introduction to the habitat and how you go about setting up a biotope. And then we'll do the display, and I'm sure Steve will chivvy me along if I need to go faster. And if anyone can't hear anything or would like me to repeat something, please just say so. So as we go into the wet season, you can see farms, ranches, and homes, they have to be raised up, otherwise they'll get flooded. So we have the river coming through here. It bursts its banks. It floods the forest. It floods the meadows, and it connects with lakes and reservoirs. And it also leaves small isolated pools in other areas. And the fishes in the wet season will move out of the river and into this flooded landscape. So Brazil is an incredibly diverse region for fish. So far there's around 3,000 freshwater species which are known to science, but the knowledge shortfall, the distance between what we know exists and what we think is out there, is massive, and there may be more than 9,000 freshwater fishes. However, quite a few of them might be going extinct before we even know that they exist due to habitat destruction and degradation. The Pantanal covers a vast area, about 14,000 square kilometers. I'm sorry, I haven't managed to convert that for you guys. 80% is seasonally flooded. My book editor, who is a New Yorker, he told me, Ty, you need to convert everything into freedom units. I said, I will ask everyone's patience. And I'm sure Google could do the job. So it has around 270 species of fishes, including many which we find in the aquarium trade. Why does that keep clicking? Okay. So I'm going to go through the different primary habitats that we encounter there. If the clicker can stop jumping the gun, that would be great. So in the wet season, as I've explained, the landscape becomes flooded. And those floods, the water's very stagnant. Because of that, it's very clear. we've got lots of sunlight penetration, and therefore we get the growth of aquatic plants, like the beautiful Ludwigia inclinata, really red, and the giant water lily, which you could try and sit on, but you will go through it, and then it has horrendous spines on the underneath, which as you try and clamber back out, will scar you horribly, as I know from experience. So, the dry season in May to November, the rivers and tributaries, hello.
Is that Boliviana, Victoria Boliviana, the
Victoria Amazonum. So it's the Amazon one, but it goes. So the Pantanal, just to say, is about 2,000 miles south of the Amazon basin, which in Brazil is not far, but it is quite far away. So in the dry season, as the waterways become restricted and the waters shrink and the water retreats from the flooded landscape, fishes and other animals are concentrated in the channels, and a lot of the aquatic plants, which we'll encounter later, die and dry out. So we start with the river channels, so the main channels that move through the landscape. The wet season, this is where the action is. All the fishes are coming together to breed, to feed. There's a huge amount of newly submerged habitat along the banks, branches and logs, vegetation. So there's an abundance of food and habitat to breed and also to hide from the many, many predators that we have here. Let's see if this video wants to play. No, there's a video in here that I was hoping would play. Is there a way of making it play?
Click it on your computer.
Let's see. No. Sorry, guys. Technical issues. Okay. Anyway. Just going to see.
This one?
Yeah.
You just have to use the...
Okay, I may come and stand over there and do this. So I just wanted to show you, you can see the submerged log there. There was a big wolffish. And you can see the water's quite clear during the wet season because as the water levels rise and the landscape becomes flooded, the currents are diffused. And this allows the sediment in the water to sink down and create these very clear, relatively clear conditions. You can see there's various tetras living in here along the submerged roots and branches that have fallen into the water. So along the banks now, we have these flooded marginal plants like this Ipomaea. We have the larger fishes moving in to predate the many smaller fishes, such as the Serpae tetra, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And let me play that for you. So this is actually habitat for Corydorus hastatus, but also cichlids such as Crenicycla semifasciata, Crenicycla lepidota, and the earth eater, wonderfully named Satanoperca papaterha, the devil's earth-eating fish, which I think is a great name. You can see this plant. This is all hornwort, Ceratophyllum demersum, and it's recovering after the dry season, so it's looking pretty tatty, but it's a great habitat for fishes, and you can see some nymphea up here, and various small tetras. So let's go through here. Here again, this, The dry season is actually a really difficult time to be a fish, because as the waters recede into the channels, it becomes very easy for predators to snap you up. That includes herons, egrets, giant otters, jaguars, caiman, hawks, and people. So it's not ideal. Your access to habitat is reduced, and the amount of food available is also reduced. So you can see these holes in the riverbank. In the wet season, they would be underwater. This is where you would find many catfish, swamp eels, other fishes would reside. In the dry season, they lose access, and the holes are inhabited instead by birds such as swifts and swallows and other species. In the dry season, the fish diversity and abundance drops, so there are fewer fishes and fewer species. But there's a few constants. Hopleus malabaricus, the wolffish, you can see one hiding in here, they're everywhere. We've got various plecos, Hippostomus, Cochleodon, and we've got the freshwater stingray family, Potama trigon, and you can still see them in very shallow habitats. The water visibility is reduced because as the water levels fall and the channels become concentrated, the current increases, and this picks up all the sediment, and it becomes hard to see anything. I'll see if I can show you that. So you're trying to spot fish and film underwater, and your visibility is about 1 meter or less, and it's very hard to see anything. And all this detritus gets stuck on the camera lens, and you get very frustrated, and you have to go outside and sit in the sun and calm down. So along the riverbanks, as the water falls, all the vegetation that was living there, Pontidaria and other marginal plants, begin to die off. They sink down into the mire, they get burned by the sun, they get dried out. But that process of death is actually very important. All that organic material breaks down, creates this wonderfully rich sediment, and that will fuel the boom of botanical and animal life the following wet season. So to show you here, even in the dry season, when the water is very low, you have these areas of exposed sand where we get fishes such as Apistogramma combrae, who like to hang around objects such as snail shells, Rhinoloricaria parva, some of the whiptail catfish, you can find them out on the open sandbanks. We have the tributaries. These are smaller rivers and channels that flow into the larger rivers. And in the wet season, we can see they're very full, and they flood the surrounding meadows, and they inundate all the terrestrial vegetation. However, in the dry season, those tributaries shrink back, so we start off with a little bit of water, becomes less and less, and by the end of the dry season, all the water has evaporated, and we're left with a dry channel covered in terrestrial plants. So the dry season is really, really excessive period of change. It goes from this complete underwater world to an area where water actually becomes quite hard to find, very difficult for fish, and also difficult for many of the plants. The Pontidaria, some of which we've got today and we're going to use in our display, can become stranded and then begins to burn, the same as the water hyacinths, the Icornia. But again, all that death is vital for life. That they have terrible injuries. They're missing eyes, the fins are damaged, the tails have been ripped apart. Hello, you have a question? Cyclosoma dimorus. It doesn't have a common name. In Brazil, they just call it acará, which is the generic name for any cichlid. But it has these really sharp spines on the operculum and on the fins. And what happens is it gets picked up by herons and egrets, and they try and swallow it, and they can't. It's too spiny. So they drop it. And then another heron comes along and picks it up and can't swallow it. And it goes on and on and on. But the fish survives, except it survives with all these terrible injuries, but it survives until the rains return the following season, and there's enough food to breed. And this is why it's found absolutely everywhere all the time. We saw in that earlier image the lagoons along the river. These are sort of nurseries and refuges. Even in the wet season, they flood, they fill up, they surround the surrounding countryside with water. Many fishes will move into them because they're free of the really big predators, such as the giant catfish in the main river channels. So they're good places to go into to breed and find food. Fishes such as the Satanopeca papaterra really enjoy it because the sediment and the silt is very light. It's full of small animals, microinvertebrates that they can eat. And so they'll go in there and feed during the wet season, bulk up as much as possible before the hard times of the dry season. The stagnant waters are very clear in the lagoons, so it's a great place for aquatic plants to thrive. Various species of nymphea grow in there, and this creates ideal habitat for small fishes. All these stems of the lilies are really good at breaking up the lines of sight of predators, so it's a good place to go and avoid being easily snatched up by a bigger fish. The lagoons continue to provide refuge into the dry season as well, and they hold more water than most of the other habitats. So you'll find big fish that get stranded in there, such as freshwater stingrays like this Potamotragon matoro. So you can see one moving through that really thick silt. If I were to step on that silt, it would come up to my hip or higher. So it's very difficult to do any research there because you get off the boat, you put your feet down, and you just disappear. It's also full of freshwater stingrays who don't like being stepped on and have one response to being stepped on, which is to sting you, which is not fun when you're very far from a hospital. So the lagoons are these refuges during the dry season as well. Everywhere else has lost its water, but there's still enough there for large and small fishes to try and wait for the rains to return. There are also lakes. Lakes can be man-made reservoir, but also natural lakes. And again, These are important as habitat for fish to move into during the wet season when they connect to the rivers due to the floods, get away from really big predators, and make use of all the resources that you can find there, such as food and habitat. I like to put a GoPro on the bottom of the lake and then go for lunch and come back an hour later, pick it up, and see who's been to come to check out the camera. And particularly the Oscar cichlids, they're very curious. They'll come up, they'll push the camera around, they want to know what's going on, which can be very annoying if you've left the camera and you find it's been knocked up and it's looking up at the sky. The other thing I enjoy doing, I was telling Andre about this, I go in to have some dermatological care. I sit in the lake, put my feet down, and the small characins will come and pick at the dry skin. I know, lovely. They will rip out some leg hairs, which is not always great. They're very determined to do this, I'm not sure why. But you can see, I think you guys call it the black skirt, we call it the black widow tetra, Gymnocorimbus ternitsai. They really enjoy coming up and picking at your feet. And in these lakes, there's loads of cichlids, pike cichlids, and this is also where piranhas congregate. Most of the piranhas don't actually eat fish, they eat fins. They are adept at racing in, taking a chunk out of fin, and swimming away. So this is just a sped up video of a lake where I left the camera. You can see it's absolutely full of fishes. And this is during the dry season. They've all been concentrated into the lake, which becomes a problem. They're now isolated from the river. If a family of giant river otters go in there, or many caiman, the large sort of crocodile-like animals we have, are in there, these fish are doomed. But you can see that there's many, many, many of them. Sorry, Melanie.
You know what that silver tetra is
With the black spot? That's Serapinus grigi or Serapinus caliurus. They're two very similar related species. You do sometimes find them in the hobby, but often they come in as bycatch. But they're from the Paraguay basin. And you can see it's really confusing when you see all those little black dots. That's the whole point. If you're a predator, you can't single out a single fish to attack. So the dry season, the lakes can go from being paradise to being prison. They become disconnected from the river channels, and suddenly you're in this shrinking body of water. It's getting hotter, the oxygen levels are falling, and it's full of very, very hungry caiman who are determined to feed up before the dry season gets worse and there's no fish. Between the rivers and the lakes and the lagoons are the water meadows. So these can be predominantly grasses or shrubs, and they become flooded. This is the habitat we're going to look at doing in the tank today. So you can see here the meadow is under about a foot of water. Lots of marginal and terrestrial plants can survive being submerged for quite a long time, and you can have lots of leaf litter, twigs, branches, and terrestrial plants as part of the habitat. And again, we see the stingrays moving in, hunting for freshwater crabs and snails in that habitat. You get cichlids like the pike cichlids, Crenicycla lepidota, will move in with their fry because it's great cover. And we'll show you here. I think this will work. Yeah. So these are Crenicycla fry, and I was checking them out, and the mother did not appreciate that. She came out to scare me off. You think I'm about 100 times bigger than this fish, and they are quite courageous and quite brave, and if you don't back off, they will bite you. So I do leave them alone. But you can see how dense that cover is. It's great habitat for keeping your babies safe. It's also Oscar cichlids. I think you may be able to see them. They'll move into here as well. They like to move under fruit trees, and where there are seeds and fruits that fall down onto that lovely stagnant water, insects as well, it's a great place to come and feed. It's like a buffet for them. The water meadows in the dry season, as elsewhere, you'll see that the water is starting to recede. Halfway through the dry season, there's a few damp areas, but by the end of the dry season, it's completely gone. The ground can be hard as concrete, quite dusty in some places, and most of the aquatic plants are dead and dying and dried out. However, as I said, all that death brings life. All those nutrients will fuel the growth of plants the following wet season. So we have the Iconias, we have Ludwigias, we have Helanthiums, and the Ceratophyllum, the hornwort. All that requires the death of organic matter from the previous season to flourish. Nymphaea are a big part of the Pantanal habitat. You can see these great big rhizomes, these root balls. When the waters recede, they remain in the sediment and in the mud, and they can survive several years in this desiccated state. As soon as a bit of rain returns, they start putting out leaves. There's not even enough water to float yet, but they're putting out the leaves, and by a few days later, there's a big shower, and there's enough water to fully come out. So you have an area that looks like a soccer pitch on Monday, and by Friday, it's this complete carpet of water lilies. There's also temporary pools and ditches. These can be isolated quite far away from the main bodies of water in the savanna, and these are great places to find aquatic plants. I'll show you some here. So we've got kabombas, like to grow in the clear water, various ludwigias, and the Amazon swords, the echinodorus, can be found here. It's also a place where animals come to drink. So we get jaguars, this jaguar footprint. You'll come down, do your field work, and you know that somewhere a jaguar is watching you, waiting for you to leave so he can come down and have a drink. So we try not to hang around, we're just worried about them being thirsty. It's also a place where you find corridoras in the ditches. This is Corridoras Aeneas. I'm sure many of you have kept them or are familiar with them. And they love these narrow ditches that run along between the meadows where there's some flow and they can hang out, and nutrients and food are brought down to them by the flow, caught on the substrate, and they can come and rootle around in it. You also find fishes like Apistogramma borelli in these habitats. And these are the red-eyed tetras. This is actually Monkhausia foresti. The one in the trade is called Monkhausia sanctophilomenae, but they look almost alike. Finally, we have flooded forests. So we have these islands, fragments of forest throughout the savannas. And as elsewhere, fishes will move out of them in the wet season and go into them where there's lovely root networks, there's all sorts of habitat, there's food such as seeds and fruits. And when the waters recede, they leave these high watermarks on the trees. This is a strangler fig, which has grown around another tree as a small vine and eventually crushed it to death, suffocated it, and grown into its own tree. And in those roots, in the wet season, there'll be fishes moving through them. What we might call hardscape, but it's really sunken branches and logs, play a fundamental part in the habitat. They provide cover, such as these root networks here, which we can see in the dry season, but in the wet season they're fully exposed. Lots of cichlids would like to go into there. Overhanging flooded branches, small fishes will hide under here to avoid being predated by birds. And even a small twig like this can be important. It resides on the bottom and it acts as a trap for leaf litter and other detritus, which then starts to break down. Macroinvertebrates start feeding on it, and it becomes a hub for small fishes. So we have the submerged root networks, submerged logs. You can see the fish moving through here. It's a good place to try and avoid predators. And they also pick at all the detritus and algae that's growing on those roots. It becomes a source of secondary food supply. Leaf litter is crucial. I'm sure here in the autumn you see all the trees losing their leaves. In the tropics, that leaf litter ecosystem exists underwater as well. As I said, all that organic material is breaking down, providing food for bacteria, which provide food for tiny invertebrates, which provide food for fishes, and so on up the food chain, and also provides cover where you can hide. So here we see Crenicycla semifasciata. This is a pike cichlid, moving over the leaf litter, picking to see what he can find, trying to flush out any small aquatic insects that might be in there. That's my general introduction to the Pantanal. I'm going very quickly because I appreciate we don't have a lot of time. I thought before we do the tank, I'd give you guys a bit of an idea about how you might go about setting this up with a bit of a visual guide. So this is a Pantanal flooded meadow biotope that I've done for my book, and we'll go through here. So first, what does it look like above water? It looks like a flooded meadow. So you have grasses, you've got Polygoniaceae and other sedges and shrubs, and water lilies. They can take different forms. You get these channels through semi-aquatic plants, and you get grasses that survive being submerged for up to 6 months. Sometimes you get such large floods that so much terrestrial vegetation is flooded and begins to die, it causes a bacterial bloom, which causes an oxygen crash, which means that suddenly all the life evaporates. And you go into these flooded meadows expecting to see loads of fish, and there's nothing. If they hang around, they die because there's no oxygen. I don't know if you can hear this. Those are all the frogs. Now this is very quiet, but when you're there working and it's very hot and there's about 20,000 frogs screaming in your ear and there's also 1 billion mosquitoes trying to tear you apart, it can be interesting. But we get to find really cool fish and plants, even in a little pool like this. Best way to get around is actually on horseback. It's often too shallow for boats. There's too much vegetation that get caught up in the propellers. You can kayak around, but you could also let the horse do all the work. And it's a really nice way to look down at the biome, look down at the different habitats. You get a bird's eye view of all the plants, and also the caiman leave you alone. So as you can see, you've got this mosaic of plants. You've got the marginal semi-aquatic sedges and rushes. You've got the nymphea, that are fully aquatic. There's some kabombas in there. There's other plants which will survive being flooded for some periods of time, others that won't. It's a real tapestry of different plants. And when it's very hot, it's a great place to chill out and cool off in the middle of your field work. To give you an idea what it looks like underwater, you can see some hornwort, Ceratophyllum here. It goes red in the tropical sun, and all the flooded vegetation, terrestrial vegetation, and already fishes have moved in and are beginning to occupy this habitat. So you can see it's very brightly lit as well. So you move through, and you never know what you're going to find. It might be a caiman, it might be an anaconda, it might be nothing at all, but it's always interesting. So I think this will play. These are some of my favorite fish, broken line tetra, Hemigrammus ulreyi. And this is in a river that's flooding a nearby meadow. So suddenly there's all this habitat and food, and you get these great accumulations of small characins, small fishes that bring other fish to predate them. You can see the leaf litter, we can see flooded terrestrial plants. You can see how rich that area of habitat is. Let's go. So, oops, sorry. I mentioned leaf litter. We've got some botanicals today that we're going to use in our display to try and recreate this organic tapestry here, which is so fundamental to the habitat. You can see some branches and twigs that will fall in. We've got some to use in our display. And we've got plants, Polygoniceae. Kindly had some plants donated by Andre, which look very similar and which will let us do the same effect. When you're out there doing fieldwork, this is with my team, you can see the habitats can be really shallow, barely higher than your ankle, and we use these very fine nets. We dip in, we pull it out, and then we have to sort through the leaf litter and detritus, which can be fun. There's giant water scorpions, which have a horrendous bite and that sting horribly, and they don't like being picked up. And as you're looking for fishes through this, they will get you. You'll get stung by corridoras. You might be bitten by a wolffish. It's good fun. Let's just show you some parameters on here. If anyone wants more parameters from these habitats, I've got some slides I'm very happy to send you. So this is to show you, this is on Monday, flooded depression. By Wednesday, quite a bit of rain, and it's expanded. By Sunday, it's almost gone. The rainy season is not continuous rain every day of the week. It may rain heavily on one day, less on another, and then nothing for a week, and the tropical sun evaporates the habitat. So if you're a fish, you need to get in and get out very quickly, or you could become stranded. Such as large dorado, Salminis brasilensis, they'll move in there, hoping to hunt for smaller fishes that don't have anywhere to escape to. Something you might notice here, the huge amount of algae, or algae, as you guys say, which is covering these terrestrial plants. And we can see some Rathbun's tetras. These are one of my favorite tetras. I think you guys call them the fire tetra, perhaps. They'll move into this habitat to graze on that algae. The water is stagnant, it's clear, and there's high sunlight, perfect for algae to grow, and fishes will utilize that. So we can see here, I think, you see how rich their colors are. And if you look at them in the hand, they are incredibly green.
What tetra is that?
This is Aphiocarex rathbuni. I think maybe here it's known as the green fire tetra in some shops. We call it Rathbun's tetra. And they're really rich greens. And the reason is they eat all this green matter, and they also eat lots of invertebrates, which gives them their lovely red color. What kind of plants would you use to do a flooded meadow biotope? Well, I've mentioned we've got Persicarias, Polygoniceae, the nymphaeas. You can also use Myriophyllum aquaticum, Myriophyllum brasilensis, Ludwigias, such as Ludwigia inclinata. We can have our marginal plants. This is Ipomaea, which grows along the banks and can survive being flooded, and other plants that will survive for about 6 months. A great way of doing it is finding your marginal pond plants in your local garden store, and if they can survive being submerged in half a foot or a foot of water, you can use them to create this effect. Elliot, oh, keeps doing this. Elliot, come on, you. I need to be patient. There we go. Eliocharis, hairgrass. You can see how dense these mats are. And once the waters recede, they're exposed to the sun, they'll dry out. Big rain shower, they're back the following week. Helanthium tenellum, the pygmy chainsword. You find this growing in the flooded meadows. This is in its dry, immersed form. The different polygonums we mentioned, hygrophillas, and the nymphaeas. Also Echinodorus, like Echinodorus cordifolius, which grow both along the margins and in ditches and in the main river. This is Echinodorus macrophyllus, gets quite big. You can see the Echinodorus on the banks. They're riddled with holes from insects eating them. So don't feel too bad if your Amazon swords don't look so sharp in the tank. Some of them get pretty big, almost too big to put in your 60 centimeter tank. And it's like a dog with a really big stick, right? I was collecting for an aquarium in Brazil, and they said, can you please bring us some Echinodorus, some Amazon swords? We'll give you a license to collect them. So, okay, all I need is the paperwork. And yeah, we got to find some fairly large ones. It's important to note that actually Brazilian law, collecting any plants or animals without the right documentation is a federal crime with a minimum 10-year term. And I don't know what you've heard about Brazilian prisons, but they're not fun. So we do everything by the book, and trying to smuggle plants out is also a very, very, very bad idea. Some people do it. I wouldn't recommend it. You can also use, floating plants, the Pistia stratoides, the water hyacinth, or water lettuce. This is the water hyacinth, and the salvina, which I believe we have some of today. These are really good for providing surface cover for fishes, especially newly introduced fishes, fish that might be nervous. Can also help to stop them jumping. And because these floating plants have access to CO2, atmospheric CO2, they grow very fast. They take up nutrients really quickly. They're a great way of helping to filter tanks biologically and combat algae. The floating plants, you can let them grow as mad as you like, and it'll still be biotope correct. This is hydrocotyle and stratioites, some capybara, enjoying that. And this is our team, sort of chest deep in sludge, collecting corridoras. Again, some of the plants might get a bit big for your tank. These are the giant Amazon lilies, but you can use things like the pickerel weed, the Pontidaria. Deep water plants, as we've seen, include the Nymphaea. We've got the Ceratophyllum hornwort, which is very easy to keep, grow, and get hold of. The Helanthium bolivianum, which you can find here. Ludwigia inclinata, I don't know if this is so available here in the States, but you could probably find it from someone. Cabombas, and the Nymphaeas will also grow in deeper patches of water. Eliocharis, hairgrass, grow there. This is the Ludwigia, that red plant, in a shaded area where it stays green. Bacopa myriophyloides, this is another plant you can get in the hobby. It's quite challenging, but it goes a beautiful orange color. The bladderworts, Urticularia, are very common there. You find them in the shallow habitats. Maiaca fluviatilis, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Again, the Helanthiums. And this is the pink Cabomba facata, which Steve and I were going to bring some today, but we both forgot. So I'm going to blame both of us rather than just me, whose responsibility it was. Right. This is the Ludwigia inclinata. You can see why it's perhaps my favorite aquatic plant. And in the flooded meadows with all that tropical sun and all those nutrients, it just goes, well, beautiful. I've got a list of plants that are found in the Pantanal, which you can find from my research in the US aquarium hobby and gardens. What I was going to say, if anyone would like this, I'm very happy to send it to you guys. And I've also got scans of a book which lists all the known plant species from the Pantanal, whether they're available here or not. And I'm very happy to send those to whoever would like them. Or perhaps I can make them available to someone in the group who can share them. Yes?
I see you got an unidentified or non-final Persicarius species there. Did you really only find one around that? I mean, it must have been a ton.
It's more that I'm not a botanist, and plant botany is horrendous. even many of the Nymphea, which you'd think would be really easy, you'll have 4 species that look kind of the same. You have to cut open the flower and look at the stamen to determine what they are. The Polygonum, it's looking at the seeds when they're in seed. Even my friend who did her PhD in aquatic plant botany in Brazil struggles. So if I don't know, this is basically me explaining why my ignorance is here. I put SP, just to be on the safe side. But use whatever you like. If you do a biotope tank, don't get too strict on yourself. The important thing is that it represents the habitat and the fishes and plants are happy. Don't be dissuaded if you can't find exactly the right plant species. Let's see. I'm going to go very quickly through this. Which kind of fishes? So many smaller tetras, the pygmy Corydorus hastatus, Aphiocarex netareri. These guys are quite common in the hobby. They are bullies and they will rip apart any other fish, but if you keep them by themselves, they're very nice. And you can keep them alongside the Corydorus hastatus because they have this mimicry. You see they both have the black spot on the caudal peduncle. This means that the little Corydorus can swim up into the midwater, hang out with the tetras, and use food and resources that aren't available to their cousins who are living on the bottom, whilst also being less likely to be predated. So we've seen our beautiful Aphiocarex rathbuni. Look at the colors on that. That's from eating loads of vegetable matter. So think about it. When you're keeping your tetras, your South American tetras, give them stuff like spirulina flake. It will help. They're omnivorous. They need that element. Like us, we need to have some greenery. And the Aphiocarex anisitsi, which is another beautiful fish, you can keep them together quite happily. The glass bloodfin tetra, so Prionobrama filigera is the species in the hobby. The one I know is Paraguayensis, but again, if it looks the same, sounds the same, and smells the same, just throw it in there. It'll be fine. Same with the red-eye tetras. Corydorus, for those of you that love corys, we've got Corydorus aeneus, Corydorus hastatus, Corydorus polystictus, which is quite rare, but some of you may have it, and Corydorus CF elegans. However, even the common bronze cory, Corydorus aeneus, can be beautiful if you see the green on the flanks there. And I said I would provide some cories in the wild imagery. So this is Polystictus and CF elegans feeding on a riverbank, and you see how they love to shove their noses right into the substrate. That's why it's really important to use soft, sandy substrates with cories so they can engage in natural behavior, and sharper substrates can wear away their barbels, their little whiskers, which they need to find food and to navigate. And this is in only about, this is in about a foot of water. I'm just lying on my belly, mask on, enjoying the show. Serpe tetra, I'm sure many of you guys know them. They have a bad reputation. Everyone says, oh, they're fin nippers. They are fin nippers to a degree, but if you keep them in good-sized numbers, the social hierarchy becomes established quite quickly, and the aggression stays within the group. The guy who's boss and biggest manages to keep everyone else in line. If you keep them in small numbers, they establish that hierarchy, and then they start to look around at who else they can bully, and why isn't that fish behaving as I think it should? And it might not be the same species, but they will go and nip its fins. In a larger group, although the hierarchy becomes established quickly, there's always a new challenger. There's always some guy who wants to be boss. This means that the aggression stays in the group. And when they color up, they're beautiful. You can see the reds here. I'm sure some of you know the gold tetras, the ones from the Amazon with the brilliant gold color. They have that color because they're infected by a trematode parasite that gets into the scales and augments the guanine levels, turns them gold or silver. And this can happen to other fishes, including the Serpe tetras. It looks beautiful. It's really bad news for the fish. What happens is, suddenly, you're visible to every predator, and you stand out. And this is because the parasite completes its life cycle in the guts of bigger predators. So we think, oh, that looks great. And the fish thinks, oh, God, I'm doomed. But hopefully it doesn't know it. It doesn't have a mirror. So we can see some Serpe tetras. You can see the gold one here, how he stands out compared to the regular red ones. And this is an issue. I don't know if any of you can spot the predator in here, but this twig is not a twig. This is a juvenile wolffish, and he's just lying in ambush. So yeah, it sucks if you're the guy that stands out. These are black widow tetras, Hyphesibrychum megalopterus, except in the region of Brazil where I work, they are red. If you go 300 miles north to the Guaporé, they are black. And the ones which were originally brought into the hobby in the 20s and 30s and imported into Germany were brought in from the Guaporé. But they are the same species. Why the ones in the south are red, I'm not sure, but it allows them to blend in with the Serpae tetras. So here's a black phantom, and the others are Serpaes really, really well. And the colors on them are something else. And this is just lying on an area where boats are launched. And the fish come to check you out because you're something new. Are you edible? Are bits of you edible? Not sure, but everyone comes and has a look. And they're curious about the camera. In the hobby, you can sometimes find quite red black phantoms, particularly the females. So if you're very selective and try and find really red females and the reddest male, you can try and give them that more red color. And just to show you here. So when they start mixing with the Serpae tetras, they become almost indistinguishable. And they're swimming alongside the Ulreae tetra, or the broken line tetra, Hemigrammus ulreae, which is a lovely, lovely fish, tends to go in and out of fashion. It's probably easier to find here in the States than in the UK, but they are very peaceful, very beautiful, and if you feed them, as I did, food intended for trout farms, they get quite big and chunky and muscles bursting through. Sorry. Dwarf, come on. Dwarf. It's because I'm English, isn't it? It's determined to, right, one more try. There we go. Epistogramma borelli, the dwarf cichlids, and Epistogramma trifasciata, and Epistogramma combre are found in the Pantanal. We've got Mesonorta festivum, great fish for slightly larger tanks. But the little epistos, they are absolutely stunning. And I know that Steve is probably your guy to talk to about breeding them. I'm sure some other people in here have got the experience, but they are delightful fishes. You've got other things like the giant silver hatchetfish, Thoracocarex stellatus, Rhinoloricaria parva, Munchausia bonita, which sometimes turns up in the trade. This is a head and tail light tetra, but it's not the one from the Amazon. This is Hemigrammus neptunus. The Amazon one is Hemigrammus ocellifer. But again, if no one knows, they don't need to know, right? You can put them in your tank, and they look the same, and they do the same job. And this is a species that doesn't come into the hobby. This is Pyrrolina australis. But you can see them in their breeding colors here, and they're really, really lovely fish. Sorry, I'll go back. That is my list of Pantanal fishes. Again, I'm happy to send that to anyone who wants it. So you can see there's a fair few that you can find in the hobby, or others that you can substitute. So like the Munchausia forestae, you can use M. sanctifilaminae instead. It looks exactly the same. Briefly, substrate. Substrates are really important. As we said with our corridors, you want nice, soft substrates. Same with the Rhinoloricaria, so they can bury themselves in. And you can use nutrient-rich substrates to support your plants, just as happens in the wild. And you can see here something called the nuclear-forager relationship. The nuclear is the corridora. They're moving through, they're disturbing that sediment, they're exposing all these small microinvertebrates and other little tidbits in there. And the followers are these Aphiocarex dentatus swimming behind them, hoping to snap up anything they can find. Hardscape, I mentioned earlier about branches and logs. Entire trees and logs might be a bit difficult to put in your tank, but you can certainly put in twigs and branches. The fish will appreciate that. The cover, broken lines of sight, and areas where they can hide are really important. Even snail shells can be habitat, and fish will like to congregate around them because debris and leaf litter will build up against them. And again, that provides habitat and provides food. We can see we've got a big log here. There's some gravels. Sometimes you find that in some stretches where the water flows more quickly, lifts the sediment, carries it away, and leaves exposed gravel or clay. I'm finishing the presentation, and we'll go on to setting up the tank very quickly. But I just wanted to say Pantanal is an amazing, amazing habitat. It's a habitat that many people have never heard of. They are the largest wetlands in the world, and they are disappearing before our eyes, mostly due to beef, cattle ranching, and soy production. And it's 95% of the Pantanal is privately owned by large ranches. And they tend to be able to do whatever they want, such as setting fire to huge tracts of land, and they will burn the wetlands away so they can then plant or put cattle on it. And this is when I was working there. This is about 2 in the afternoon, and you can see the sun, blood red. That's from all the smoke, from all the fires. So we're trying to work, and there's this acrid smoke. And maybe there was a water meadow that you were exploring last month. You go back, and it's nothing but ash. And the problem is when the floods return, and that meadow is flooded, and the fish move out of the river expecting habitat and seeds and insects and roots, there's nothing. There's a desert of ash. And so they don't have the opportunity and the resources that they need to reproduce for the following year. And you multiply this many, many times, and very soon the ecosystem will start to fall apart. You can visit the Pantanal. I strongly advise doing it. There's many great lodges and places to see. In the dry season, you can go and see jaguars. You can see all sorts of big mammals. In the wet season, it's great for birds and fish. And people sometimes say, what can we do to, what thing can we do to raise awareness? I say, just talk to your friends, talk to colleagues, read up about it, and say, hey, have you heard about the Pantanal wetlands? They're amazing. You start looking, you'll find documentaries, you'll find videos, you'll find information. The more that it's in the popular conscience in the way that the Amazon is, the more attention it will receive and the better chance it has of being conserved, at least most of it. Thank you very much, everyone. Yeah. Thank you.
But that's just the first step.
Yes.
Let's get the camera on the tank. Try to step on the laptop.
When your video's in the water, do you use like a GoPro or
I do use a GoPro sometimes. I also use a Olympus TG Tough camera, and they're quite good for taking. Sorry, they're quite good for taking photos. But the GoPro is really great because you can just leave it and come back and see what's appeared on it. So, thank you.
Last call for ballots. Got me outstanding. Ballots. David, right there. Substrate in there.
I've got some substrate. I may need some scissors or a knife. I guess maybe someone could sit and hold the microphone, or I can.
Let's get you the clip-on mic.
Okay.
I'll go grab that.
I'll just,
Melanie, do you mind helping with plants? So you want to get plants set in trays?
while I'm here, does anyone else have any questions they want to ask about the Pantanal itself, or about the fishes or the plants before I start setting up? Yes, sir.
How remote is that when you help get the plants in trays? What can I fly into? How does one go?
The interesting thing is it's not always so remote. It might be 4 hours away from the nearest big town. You would fly into Sao Paulo, and then that's about 10 hours from here. Then another 2 hours to a town called Campo Grande. The microphone might be dying. Sorry.
My fault.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Put that on.
Is that all right? Can you hear me, sir? You can hear me? And then depending where you want to go, you might drive 5 hours or you might drive 15 hours. But then you need to get on a boat because the car can only go so far, and you might need to do another 10 hours on the boat. So in terms of miles, it's not so remote, but if you needed to get back to a hospital quickly or something, it would not be an easy task. So that's how it is. Yeah. All right. Got a team here to help me. It's great.
You want this open?
You guys are going to do all the heavy lifting and
All
the
the
dirty
heavy
work,
lifting,
and I'm just going to
dirty work.
supervise. Okay, great.
So you just stay out there?
So I was doing my master's research there, and we'd go and stay on a base, sometimes an environmental police base, which is very, very basic. If we were lucky, a ranch or one of the eco lodges would let us stay with them, and you might be out there for several weeks or a month doing the field work, and you go back to the city with all your specimens, all your data, back to the university lab, work there, wait until you go back. So I was looking at the differences in the fish community between the wet season and the dry season. So I'd go out every couple of months to measure that and spend a couple of weeks there. But I've been going there regularly since 2007. So, yeah. Am I in the way of? Yeah. Okay.
It's a
How did that get funded for you to be out there?
Good question. Small research grants from Brazilian government, but that dried up when the last president, Mr. Bolsonaro, came to power. He cut all the funding for natural sciences. A lot of it's privately funded by me. So if I can go out there on a trip, I will work to raise money and then go out there for a month, do everything I can, come back, be poor for a while, eat bread and butter. It's really hard to get funding, particularly because it's not as well known as, say, the Amazon or other biomes. So it's, private, bit of research grant, bit of begging people. That's how it works, yeah.
Ty,
Yes.
so when I was in Brazil, there was a thing where like capybara meat was considered fish for purposes of Lent. Was that
Well,
going on when you were there?
capybara meat being considered fish is a legacy of a medieval practice that you weren't allowed to eat meat on Friday, right? So the monks in the monasteries in Europe and in the UK decided, well, if it lives on or around water, it's probably a fish, which means you could eat geese, you could eat duck. It's a fish. I'm not breaking the law. And when the Spanish and the Portuguese went to the Americas and they built their first monasteries, they had to observe the same customs, and they thought, well, again, it lives in or around water, it's probably a fish, and this is how the capybara, the world's largest rodent, ended up being a fish and on the menu on Fridays.
Does it taste like fish or more like
I haven't eaten it myself. On my university campus in Brazil, we had quite a few families of them who'd sort of wander through the campus. We had macaws, we had boas, we had all sorts of other animals, but no one was trying to eat the capybara, not to my knowledge. A lot of caiman. They're generally quite peaceful. The big males, they'll come up and bump you because they want to know who you are and what you're doing in their patch. But when they realize you're not another caiman, they normally get away quite quickly. They can get scared. They turn around, and maybe like alligators do, they do this big tail flap, which is to try and distract you. But if the tail hits you and you're snorkeling in the water, you get knocked out. That's more problematic than their teeth. The anacondas are the same. They don't want anything to do with you. And if you meet them, they'll try and get away from you. Or if they're really, really big, say 15 to 20 feet, you're not even an issue. You're not a threat, and they'll just hang out and be fine with you. Yeah. Sure. What was the? It's Cyclosoma dimorus. If you like, afterwards, I'll write it down for you. Yes, Melanie.
So I have a question on setting up
Yeah.
the actual biotope tank with the plants.
Yeah.
Do you use RO or CO?
I like to use CO2 where I can because it just gives the plants a bigger, chance. I don't use RO. I use a 50-50 mix of
Okay.
tap water and rainwater,
Okay.
and try and just keep it stable.
Okay.
They won't be damaged if you use RO, but it's cheaper and easier not to.
Yeah, I tried to do because I use straight RO from some of my biotope setups,
Sure.
and adding the CO2, it wasn't
Yeah,
the
it
greatest combination.
can be tricky.
Yeah, it was a little bit tricky, so maybe I'll try
All right.
the mix rather than just a straight RO.
Should I start doing this tank now? Is everyone ready? Okay, cool. Great. That's what I like about America. You're a yes people. In England, we say, oh, I don't know, maybe. Here they say, do it. So I'm going to do it quite quickly, and I'm doing it in this small tank because I'm a strong believer in. Yeah, is it? Sorry. Is up here better? Is that better at all? Yeah? Okay. I'll try and speak up. I like using small tanks because it makes it more accessible for most people. And that's what my whole mission is to connect people with nature, connect people with aquatic animals and plants, get them inspired. And it's no good if you say, oh, you need the most high-tech, large aquascape. Keep it simple and keep it accessible. So a lot of our plants, they take up nutrients through the roots. So we need to give them some nutritious substrate. But we want to think about how the layout's going to be. In a biotope, you don't need to worry too much about the aquascaping aesthetics. but you still want to create areas of depth, so something close to the front, something near the back, so it doesn't look two-dimensional, and also creates habitat where fishes can hang out and be out of view, which is really important for increasing their confidence. Microphones kicked in. And make them look better because they're feeling more confident. In this kind of display, I might usually do a V shape. So you've got plants on this side, and an open arena in the middle. I don't have so much soil, so instead I'm going to do something a little different. And we'll start by, as you say, going for it. We're just going to put all that soil in here. And we're going to do sort of one corner, quite heavily planted. And the soil is going to sit underneath a cap of substrate of sand, which is over here. So we've got nutritious substrate down there that plants can reach down through the sand, get their roots into.
Excuse me just a
Hello,
second.
sir.
Cover your mic up.
Cover my mic up?
Yep. Excuse me. Everybody's back there talking. Some people up here are still trying to listen. So if you want to talk, either be quiet or go into the hallway by the bathroom. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. All right. So we've got quite a bit of sand in here.
I don't know what's on your shirt, but the mic's picking up the...
Ah, this is the mic for the video. Yeah? Sorry about this, folks. I could be a tech bro. Move over. Take your robotics and get out. Oh. So we've got this lovely sand here. Yeah, a cup would be great, actually. And like we saw in the video, you can have sands, and the sand can be made up of organic matter, silt, sediment, broken organic debris, and also elements of clay and sand itself. Again, you don't need to worry too much about the composition, as long as it kind of looks right and it's suitable for your plants and for your fishes. So I think Melanie was grabbing me a cup, but I'll start with a hand. So we've created this mound of soil here, which is where the bulk of our planting is going to be. So our plants can put their roots down into that and feed. Here's Melanie with a cup. Thank you so much. Wonderful. All right, makes life easier. So we're going to put sand at the front as well. This is going to be our stage, our arena. If we were putting corries in here, we'd want to see them moving over. And the sand at front can be quite fine. We don't need to use a lot because we're not planting into it. And we can just, there's no hard and fast rule. Let's just put it in, and we want a little bit of depth because if we were putting corries or dwarf cichlids in here that like to shuffle and move around the substrate, we want them to be able to do that without running out of sand. Now we also need to put substrate on top of our aquatic plant soil. You can plant first and then put sand in, but that actually is quite laborious, so I'm just going to put the sand over the top of it and try and remember exactly where I want to plant. We want a fair depth of substrate because some of our plants are heavy root feeders, and also if we don't plant them into deep substrate, they'll just float up initially before they get a chance to anchor themselves properly. A lot of our substrate, we're not even going to see it because we're going to cover it with botanicals, the seeds and leaves and twigs. So let's put a bit more in here. So all the time we're thinking, how is this going to look from the front? And what it's worth doing is actually standing in front of the tank. You get a sense of the perspective, a sense of the depth. But our planting is going to come out from this rear corner towards the middle here. And that means we'll have this area of plants here. If you have any nervous or small fishes, they can go around behind it, stay out of view. But it'll also create that sense of depth, vegetation at the front, vegetation at the back, and then a more open arena at the front. So, here's some I made earlier. These have been kindly soaked by Steve. These are small, I don't know what kind of wood this is. Spiderwood, yeah. Black spiderwood. Small, spindly pieces. These are great for creating complex habitat where fishes can go into, feel secure. Dwarf cichlids, if they have young, they can herd the fry into there, and it prevents them being stressed. So we'll pull those out and decide where we want them to go. I think that's simple. So we're thinking about our structure. Our planting is kind of here. So where there's lots of plants, there's no overhanging trees, right? So we wouldn't put all our pieces of wood there because they would have fallen from said tree. So we're actually going to do something unconventional. Most of our hardscape is going to be out in the open area. But this also creates interest, because if we had fishes like corries, they'll be moving through and amongst this. But we're still going to use a bit of an aquascaping rule. We're going to create this triangular layout, very simple. We'll put a bit in there, and we will find our tweezers. Quite a selection of tools here. So our plants actually form our real hardscape. Our structure is made up of the plants, and we've got to think, what are they going to look like as they grow and as they develop? So we've got these Persicaria, which we saw many photos of. These guys, if you allow them, thank you, Melanie, can grow up and out of the tank. I really like plants that do that because it creates a second world above what we're seeing in the water. We can imagine that there's something going on above the surface. Is there the forest? Is there the meadow out there? And again, you let those plants grow out above the surface. They have access to CO2. This means they grow faster and stronger. They pull up nutrients more quickly. And that also acts as a biological filter. So we will start with our tallest piece. And we're going to create this tall column of planting. We push it quite far down because we want those roots to have access to the aquatic soil underneath. And obviously these are going to grow quite dense over time, so you may want to thin them out. And as you thin out the Persicarias, you can prune them, and the cuttings you can plant, and they too will take root. And eventually you can build a really dense kind of bush. This is a lovely plant. Underwater, the leaves go this sort of soft purple and pinkish. Above the surface, they go more of a green and purple, dark purple color. I think this, Andre, you said there were several species here, right? This SP Sao Paulo and Cawaguiam, is that it? What's the other one? Yeah. Which is technically an Asian species, but we're not being precious. It looks like the plants in the Pantanal. And this is something I'm really keen on, that people create a biotope or a natural style display, and someone else comes along, normally on social media, and they say, hey, you've used a plant from the left bank of the river and a fish from the right bank of the river, and your biotope is invalid, and you are a failure, and you should go and live under a rock. And that kind of gatekeeping annoys me, because, hey, this is someone who's made an effort. This is someone who's trying to connect with nature and share that activity and celebrate it. There's other ways we can criticize, or not criticize, we can actually give positive feedback. We can say, hey, I really like what you did, but if I was going to do it, I would maybe use this species, or have you tried using this? Or you know what, this is actually one that's more authentic, and try using that. We've got some Ludwigia. This is, again, not a species native to the Pantanal, but it will perform the role of species which are native and which we can't get hold of. And we want to put this slightly out into the mid area. It'll grow up into a tall bush, and it'll create this shaded area just down here where fishes can congregate and feel secure. Thank you, Melanie. Remember when you're planting that things are going to grow. Don't plant them too close together, maybe an inch, 2 inches apart. Give the plant that room to expand and to grow. And don't worry if at the beginning it looks a little rough and ready. It looks rough and ready in nature anyway, and it will soon fill out. So we're going to create this really dense stand of planting here. Thank you so much. And the nice thing about these are all fairly easy plants. They'll even grow without CO2. They don't need very high light. They'll be happy with medium levels of light. And you can find them without too much difficulty. So we're blending the Ludwigia, we're blending the Persicaria. So the Persicaria is going to climb up and out above the surface, and the Ludwigia is going to go up to it and maybe rise a little bit above it. And that creates these height differentials, which also provide visual interest and stop the tank looking, too monotonous and too samey. But we are following that aquascaping principle of taller plants at the back and smaller ones at the front. If anyone has any questions, please yell at me, and let me know.
Is that wood heavy, or does it need something to hold it down?
It was soaked overnight by Steve, so I'm hoping that it'll stay soaked. Yeah, when you buy them, they're very lightweight. So if you've got a rain butt or something, you can throw them in. Same with the leaf litter. If you have a partner or a spouse who doesn't appreciate their stove being covered in tannin-stained water, yeah, maybe don't boil it there, but you don't need the spout. Okay, well, no. Melanie's compromised there. It's all right. Making a bit of a mess back here, so
My family knows now. They're like, oh, she's boiling leaves again.
you can smell it.
They know the smell.
That happened in my house last night.
They're like,
My mother-in-law
oh.
thought I was making chili, and then she looked in the pot, and she was very disappointed.
They're like, oh, you're making leaves again.
Fake little Woody.
Yeah, a little leafy.
I have my dedicated pots now.
Smell like really good tea.
They do.
Really good tea. I'm really struggling not to drink it.
Once as a teenager, my mother was away for a week, and I thought this would be a great time to soak some wood in the bath. Now, it turns out that if you leave the wood in the bath for a week, it stains the side of the tub, and nothing gets it out. And yeah, that was the last time I did that. Yeah, but she still supports me and still helps me, so I am her only son, so she doesn't have much choice. If there was another one, she might have not been so kind. Yeah, I was thinking that. That's all right. Well,
Where are you going to shove the haunted area?
careful with that question. Right in this back corner, I have left a space, and I've... Yeah, so we saw in some of the photos the pontidaria that grows in the meadows and along the channels, and again, this is a species that grows right up and out of the tank. For our purposes here, we've got this light that's resting on the glass, but with these species, you might want one that's suspended a little bit higher, and these produce a beautiful flower. They can flower in the aquarium, and we're going to push him right down so his roots, because they're heavy root feeders like Amazon swords, have direct access, sorry about the microphone back and forth, direct access to the nutrients down there. That's all right. Thank you. Okay, right. May have more plants than I need, but okay. We saw lots of water lilies in the photos, different nymphea. It can be quite tricky to get authentic species, but we can use like the Nymphea zinckeri, the red lotus, which is very available in the trade, and kind of we've been donated some. And it will perform the same role as the wild ones. Now, the lilies often tend to be on the edge of the taller marginal plants, otherwise they get crushed. They're searching for that open water. So we're going to put them out on the edge here, and they'll sit over this open stage, and that will dapple the light. It also makes the fish feel more confident, and also creates interest. We've got this really shafts of light coming down. We've got these pools of shade, and the fish is moving through it. Not everything is on display all the time. That makes it much more interesting.
Do you let them come to the surface?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. If you can prune them if you want to, but I let them sort of run riot.
I've had lilies sprout out of botanicals and leaf litter.
Yeah.
I've had, I guess it was a seed pot, like one of the round little
And it just went for it.
seeds, and then weeks later, all of a sudden, I have a lily sprouting out of the seed pod.
I think it's one
They've
of
been dried.
one of my favorite plants is
Yeah.
because they can survive being
Yeah.
dried out, and then they come like Lazarus. They come back, and they give us real pleasure when they do. So the ones in here are quite small. They will grow larger over time. And we're creating this ring of nymphea around the open water area. Go. Now I've done the bulk of the planting here. I'm going to put some of the smaller pieces of wood between the stems. You can put your wood in first and plant around it, but I find that sometimes that means you start putting your plants in real clumps rather than spreading them out as much, and it begins to look a bit contrived. And besides, the plants will grow up and around the stem, up and around the wood, sorry. So we can imagine that perhaps this sort of quite branchy piece has fallen down, broken into little pieces over time. And again, as I said, we're putting the bulk of it in the more open area, create some interest. But we are making a bit of a triangular layout, but very, very simple. And using the twigs like this, the wood, will also add some height in the open area. All right, so pygmy chainsaw, I just need a few. I've got far more plants than I need, but that's always worth doing. It's no good finding out you need more. So, thank you, Melanie. This cord here. Hydrocotyle like this in the Pantanal gets flooded and will grow up to the surface and can adapt to a submerged life. We're going to put some just at the back here. It's actually almost going to be covered by many of the taller plants at the front, but it creates an open area here where fishes can move into and above. And in its submersed form, it will grow lower and it'll form more of a carpet. Thank you. I think that's all I need. Thank you. And we just want to create this real mosaic of textures and heights and forms, just as it is in nature. Thank you. I've got a few strands of Mayaca. Now you might think, oh, this grows in really, really dense bushes in the wild. Often stem plants, kabombas, Mayacas, you'll find 1 or 2 stems that have grown from a few seeds from the previous year. And they may be loose, they may be covered in detritus, they may be poking through the leaf litter and just about surviving. They don't look as thick and lovely as they might do in an aquascaped display. I'm just going to put a few of them in here, and over time they would grow out and fill up the space. Just think if there's anything else I need. Probably just the floating plants and one sword. That's right. So we talked about Echinodorus, the large Amazon swords. We're going to blend that in with our Pontidaria at the back. And we've been donated a few. So it's another heavy root feeder. So we want to make sure we put it in quite deep so those roots have quick access to the aquatic soil underneath. And we can allow this plant to grow immersed as well. So it will eventually blend with the Pontidaria leaves. It creates this really pleasing texture of broad, bold leaf plants. And I think that's almost it. Yeah. Yes. The pygmy chain swords will grow on the margins of the meadows and in the meadow, as we saw. It grows in the dry period. And will also adapt to being immersed by the floods. We're just going to use a little bit on the edges here to blend our open area with the planting. So it's not this stark wall of plants and open substrate. And they will put out little daughter plants. And because we're not planting them over the very deep plant soil, they'll grow a little sparser, a little slower than they might do if we planted them into it. But that's fine. That's as they grow in the wild. And they'll put out little daughter plants, little runners, reaching out into that open area. Just need a few of them in here. Sometimes I feel like sort of an aquatic Bob Ross. Not that I'm that great, but, just going to put a little, happy little chainsword right here. Just going to let him do his thing. I got to work on the hair. I know. If you've got straight hair, you want curly hair. But Bob Ross hair is something else. Right, we've put our plants in. And why have I put my plants before I've put my leaf litter? Well, you put your leaf litter and then you try and plant through it. It's actually quite difficult. One thing I like to do with the leaf litter before I put it in, it's already been pre-soaked, pre-boiled, so it's more likely to sink down, but I crush it a bit, because in the wild it gets crushed up and it becomes slightly threadbare and tattered as it would in nature. It also squeezes out a little bit more of the air, means it's more likely to sink. And now we've got these breaks and cuts in it, we can carefully have plants push through them so that they don't lose all the light, and we can wedge our leaves in here, and we can also use the wood underneath. Because the leaves have fallen, the rains have arrived, and suddenly there's this explosion of plant life coming up from the substrate beneath them. So they'll be pushing through that leaf litter anyway. The leaves drop in the dry season, not in the wet season. We can, these leaves were brought by Andre from somewhere.
They're from South Florida. They're
Okay.
leaves. They're kind of like a weed over there, so I brought back half a suitcase.
Okay.
They go all the way down.
Tell me about that, Andre.
I was going to let you say that. I don't know what the rules are on bringing in plants across state lines, but you can use beech and oak leaves, but be careful with other leaves, especially anything that's near coniferous plants or ivies, because they can contain all sorts of nasty things that will poison our fish. But you can use some natives. So the other thing to remember is that it's very tempting to put big leaves and then little leaves on top. Leaves don't fall necessarily in order. So I've put a few big ones down, and I'm going to sprinkle, for detail, some smaller ones over the top in some areas. But in this open area, we can go crazy, and we can just sprinkle them out. And it doesn't matter if they're sitting in and amongst the branches or caught. That just makes it look all the more authentic. And as these leaves break down, they'll provide this very mulmy, slightly silty, fibrous substrate, which will go down into the sand, turn it a darker color, make it look even more authentic. And again, even in the aquarium, as they rot, we get tiny invertebrates will start feeding on them, and that can become a secondary food source for your fishes. We'll put a few in amongst the plants here, so it doesn't look too contrived.
Ty, so I know you talked to Scott Fellman and all that.
Yeah.
Have you done an aquarium that you purposefully drained and let go dry, like he does?
I haven't tried that, but I have had tanks where there was lots of leaf litter and the fish were perhaps not as loved as they should have been. And they found a fair amount of food in amongst the leaf litter. And actually they were better for it. They often had really nice condition because they're eating loads of essentially meat. And that improves color, condition. But it's you can do an experiment like that for a short period where you don't feed your fish anything except what they find in the tank. But I wouldn't recommend it because we don't have to do it. And if the animal's in our care, we should just give them the absolute best that we can. And if that involves lots of nice available food, dry food, live food, and frozen food, let's do that instead of just making them live off what they can find.
Put the leaves in as soon as they rot and they go into the soil or the sand. Do you keep adding them?
You can keep adding leaves. You can even siphon it out. Some people are, don't want loads, this depth of rotten leaf litter in there. You can siphon it out and replace it, or you can just keep adding and let it break down, let that mulmy bed build up and up and up. Depends. It's kind of up to you. I like to leave it. It just looks more natural. And while I am a sort of biotope guy, so setting up a tank that looks really like the natural habitat, I'm not too precious about it. I won't worry if I don't use exactly the right species, and I think you shouldn't either. If it looks good and it caters to the needs of the fish and the plants are happy, that's fine. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I wouldn't put a temple in here or a castle or a shipwreck. You might want to, but each to their own.
What do you got against shipwrecks?
Hey, man. I mean, I don't know how old you are, but, they were big in the 90s, and I'm a modern man. I want leaf litter. And,
You put a shopping cart in there, and some
well,
tin cans in a bottle, you get the
exactly. I once did a SpongeBob. I once did a mangrove display with glass jars, which was great, and glass beer bottles, because I'd seen that in the Philippines. And the fish loved it, because they went in the bottles and thought, hey, no one can see me. I'm in this safe structure. But you could sit and watch them, and it's quite effective.
I was just in southern Florida a couple months ago fishing the canals and such, and it's funny when you see shopping carts are very common to see in the canals, and the fish are always around them.
We when I worked at London Zoo, we had a London Canal exhibit with a shopping trolley in, and the European eels loved it because they'd go in and tangle themselves around the metal grid. And again, they thought, hey, no one can see me. but we could. And so it's not the best habitat, but they'll find a way to use it. That's what happens. So, right. We'll put in more leaf litter. We can build it up. I really love watching the fish when they go in. They start exploring under the leaves and shoving things aside, and they're looking for morsels. They're looking for tidbits. And if you have dwarf cichlids and you have fry, the little tiny babies moving in amongst the leaf litter, it's exactly as I would see it in nature. And it's so rewarding to think, hey, I've got this glass box in my suburban home, and the fish are behaving the same as they do in a wetland, 4,000 miles away. I think, that's kind of playing God in a good way.
Is that like a type tank like that where it's like good for breeding fish? Or is it because there's a lot of
If it's,
if for breeding fish just because there's a lot of
they,
space for the babies to run?
yeah, I mean, there's cover for the young. If the adults feel secure, they're more likely to breed. That secondary food source is really important. And not just the little animals, but also the sort of algae and detritus and fungi. Small fishes will start picking at that and gives them a bit of a boost. So the last thing we would do is, when we have water in here, we'd add our floating plants. So the floating plants can provide cover for fishes, and they can also help combat nuisance algae, soaking up nutrients. We've got the Philanthus fluitans, the red root floater, which is native. You can use Salvina auriculata, or Salvina natans. In Brazil, they call it the jaguar ear because of the shape and that soft texture. You can use Amazon frogbit, you can use the pistia, you can use the different Icornias, and it looks really effective. I guess we're not putting water in it?
Are we?
No? Okay. So I won't put in our floating plants into it, as they won't float. But we can use them in here. And again, they create that dappled light effect and provide security for the fishes. So you'll set the tank up, and it'll look a bit sorry, a bit sad. You're like, everything's kind of leaning over, and everything's sort of crushed down. You give it a week or so, those plants are up, and you're on the way to creating your Pantanal wetland meadow. So. You can, yeah. Thank you, everyone. Melanie raised an interesting point. You could fill this all the way, or you could fill it halfway and let those plants grow. And you could even change it up and have it rising and falling over a couple of weeks and make your floods very real. So that's the way to do it. Thank you. All right. Cool.
So much so, President Mike is surely going to be auctioning this tank off. Just tell you that the tank itself retails for around 200. Light, I don't remember offhand, but 60 or 70. Oase filter, it was donated by Oase, obviously, wherever it went, way over here. I don't know what this one goes for offhand. Do you know, Melanie?
I think this is like a $80 at least.
And this one does have the
It's
built-in
thermo.
heater.
Mhm.
So,
That's the point. All the Pantanal displays, you can run them at room temperature. Fish will be happy at, 18 Celsius. I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit. But, yeah,
Like 78.
your average room temperature,
Yeah.
they'll be very happy.
what did I just hit? I wasn't adding it up. 350-ish bucks, so, bid high. Some fortunate person. We do take credit cards, right, Mike? All right. And we want to get this lapel mic. It's 10,000 times better than the other mic.
All right. Thank you.
Can I grab that
Fantastic.
lapel
Yep.
mic from you?
Last thing to say, thank you all very, very much for having me, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Take that mic for you.
I'll go and speak to the